People became dissatisfied with absolutism and absolute monarchs. The abuses of kings and queens were rampant everywhere, and we replaced the age of absolute with the age of enlightenment. The mid-1700s was the height of the age of reason, or the age of enlightenment. We've heard that term enlightenment before. Remember, in Buddhism, to be enlightened meant to be aware of the world. Well, this is a time period that is stressed by a new intellectual movement, a movement that stresses reason and thought over the power of an individual to solve a problem. To be enlightened meant to be a scientific thinker. What makes the age of enlightenment possible? There were a lot of steps we went through. You remember the mid-1500s, we had our first scientific revolution, where man started using observation and hypothesis to question accepted beliefs. And then we had the Renaissance, where literally there was a rebirth of culture and learning. Humanism expanded everywhere, and the world became more secular at this time period. And then that open-mindedness had been replaced by the tyranny of absolutism. Mankind will always fight against a tyranny, and they'll usually replace it with an extreme. While the Enlightenment may have reached its zenith in the American Revolution, the first Enlightenment Revolution, it was really a uniquely European idea, probably a uniquely French idea in its beginning. Paris is where the Enlightenment takes off, where these philosophers, these men who questioned everything would gather in salons, and they would have these large meetings where they would discuss the social norms of the time period and debate them. This social gathering of intellectuals and artists was felt everywhere, and it inspired things like enlightened despots like Frederick the Great, and enlightened revolutions like the American Revolution. There are 5 major beliefs about the Enlightenment. The philosophers of France and later America and England and other places believed in reason above all. They believed that truth could be tested. It could be discovered through scientific principles, through making a theory, making a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, and using logical thinking to determine what ultimately was the best system. And this didn't just apply to science, it applied to societies. The second major principle of the Enlightenment is a belief in nature. It's this belief that somehow whatever exists in nature is fundamentally better than a social construct that's invented by people. Well, that can go 2 ways. that can lead to a state of anarchy where mankind lives as an animal and lives for their own wants and needs, or it could lead to belief in cooperation among people. The Enlightenment philosophers were hoping for the latter. Enlightenment philosophers also preached the importance of happiness. This idea that people should seek their own well-being on earth. And we can see these ideas in fundamental documents later on. Our own founding document talks about the pursuit of happiness. This is an Enlightenment principle. The Enlightenment is also fundamentally a progressive philosophy. Progressivism is the belief that history is a cycle of continual improvements. And progressive philosophers of the Enlightenment would believe that change is necessary, change is good, and any change must be an improvement over the absolutism of the past. The fifth and final major belief of the Enlightenment is a belief in liberty. Liberty is the freedom that we have to live our own lives. And philosophers in France and later in the United States were calling for liberties to be the liberties of mankind, these liberties that had been earned in England with things like the Magna Carta and the 1689 English Bill of Rights. Well, now they're being reflected in the United States, in the Articles of Confederation, in the Declaration of Independence, later on in France in the Declaration of Rights of Man. This idea that God granted us freedom and liberty and that we own ourselves is a really new idea, and it's an Enlightenment idea that's hung on. Probably the longest lasting thought from the Enlightenment is the idea of a social contract. You may have heard of the social contract theory before. It's this belief that while people are inherently free and people have liberty to act as they want to, in order to guarantee the security of a state or the security of a free people, people define and limit their own individual rights through a contract with a government where they agree to turn over some of these powers to the government. Think about our own founding documents. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. That's a social contract. That's saying that while our rights were granted us by God, the people have chosen to delegate some of those powers to a government in order to create a greater peace. The social contract is a pretty controversial idea throughout most of history, and it's become controversial again in recent years. In fact, if you're involved in the libertarian movement, you'll frequently hear the saying, "I didn't sign a contract." I want to look at a few of the key philosophers of the Enlightenment. This is by no means a complete list, but here's a few that are pretty important to us here in the United States at least, and I would argue in the Western world. The first one I want to talk to you about is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes lived in England during the English Civil War when Oliver Cromwell was overthrowing the King of England. And he posited that humans lived in a state of nature that is unhappy and miserable, and that state of nature had somehow to be tamed. And Hobbes would have suggested that a social contract is necessary to tame this wild, unhappy, miserable existence. Hobbes, interestingly enough, was a supporter of royal absolutism. He believed that a king should have absolute power. In fact, he wrote a book called The Leviathan. The Leviathan is named after a powerful sea monster in the Bible, where he compared that sea monster to a government. And he said that the government, like that sea monster, should be all-powerful and absolute. But he argued that the reason why the government has that absolute power is not divine right. It's not because the king was born to be king. It was because the king entered into a social contract with the people. The people gave the king that power in exchange for social stability and protection. The second Enlightenment philosopher, and to me probably the most important one, is a man named John Locke. John Locke also lived in both the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. So he saw the king get overthrown by Parliament and Cromwell, and then saw the king get overthrown by William and Mary. He also posited that mankind lived in a state of nature. But his position was that the state of human nature was a happy existence, and that liberty is more important than security. John Locke is the first person to use the term natural rights in the manner that we use it today. You've probably heard life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness before. Thomas Jefferson, right? Well, Thomas Jefferson was paraphrasing John Locke. Maybe he was plagiarizing John Locke. John Locke said that natural rights include life, liberty, and property. By property, he meant that you owned yourself and you should be able to protect the rights you have. And that the purpose of a government was strictly to protect those three rights. A government is to protect your life, your liberty, and your property. Anything beyond that is an illegal use of government. This is the foundation of at least the Articles of Confederation government, if not the constitutional government that the United States lives under. But the most important part that John Locke says is that if a government fails to protect your natural rights of life, liberty, and property, it's the duty of the people to overthrow that government. This is what Thomas Jefferson was quoting in the Declaration of Independence, a war treaty against the United Kingdom. The third of our Enlightenment philosophers is a man named Voltaire. His real name was Francois-Marie Arouet, but we'll just go by his pen name Voltaire. Voltaire was a Frenchman and a social critic of government. In fact, he had been jailed twice in his life for criticizing the royal government of France. He criticized its laws, its customs. He even criticized religion. To Voltaire, nothing was off limits. He's going to go on to be an advisor to Catherine the Great and Marie Antoinette. Voltaire was known for using his pen as a weapon. Voltaire was a social critic against any kind of prejudice. His most famous quote, and it should be on a t-shirt that we all wear, is, "I do not agree with the words you say, but I will defend to my death your right to say it." This is a principle that influenced the American concept and the British concept of free speech. Now we're going to come to JeanJacques Rousseau. Rousseau was born a very, very poor man in Switzerland, but he was also a student of the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the state of nature. He believed, like John Locke, that mankind born in a state of nature were happy and had natural rights, although he didn't define what those natural rights were. He did write a book called The Social Contract, therefore he usually gets credit for it, for that term at least, if not the whole idea, where he said that people agree to surrender their own will to submit to what he called the general will. So it's necessary for an individual to temper his own desires in order for society's desires to be realized. While he believed in the will of the majority, the social contract, he was not a big fan of large governments, although he did think they were necessary. He said that governments that get too large were going to be used to carry out the will of the majority against the minority. And sometimes you end up with the tyranny of the majority. JeanJacques Rousseau's ideas were used extensively during the growth of communism and dictatorships in the 20th century.